Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister who just resumed his seat spent the last 10 minutes telling us that this was the best budget of a generation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have to ask the question, because any young person who might have the unfortunate pleasure of having watched that speech just now would surely be asking themselves the question, which generation? Because it will certainly not feel like theirs. When you have the lowest home ownership rates since the 1950s, this generation is not patting themselves on the back and saying how lucky we all are. If it comes to employment opportunities, when we have over 87,000 young people who are not only not in employment, but not in education, not in training, and desperately looking for opportunities so they can put a roof over their head. And I would add, Minister Tolley, I would add that that's 25,000 more than when your government took office. Right. That group of young people are not saying this feels like the best budget of a generation. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what is the measure of a budget? What is the measure of a successful budget? Because you cannot sleep under the roof of a graph of GDP. And that is what people will be measuring, the success of a budget for themselves. How will they feel better off, if at all? And when you've got a situation where wages are not looking to rise according to the government's own budget in the next 2 years, and when you've got a government that has borrowed more than Muldoon, then which generation is Nick Smith talking about? And for all of the platitudes about how relative to other countries, New Zealand is not quite the same shape as other places, then that thanks goes to Helen Clark and Michael Cullen, because they were the ones that got net crown debt almost to zero before this government came into office. They set us up for a rainy day. They set us up for a rainy day. But, Mr. Speaker, I will give some applause to Nick Smith. At least he talked about the budget. The last few speakers I've heard from, the few speeches from ministers haven't even touched on some of the budget initiatives. In fact, I've heard more creepy discussion about The Bachelor from some of those government ministers, all of them male, I have to point out, than I've heard about the budget itself. And maybe that's because this budget didn't present a vision that was worth talking about. And I've sought that almost every single budget. Budgets are a government's opportunity to tell the people of New Zealand where they are going, how they're going to tackle the big issues that New Zealand is facing. But not only did this budget not present a vision, it didn't even address the here and the now. Now, I should have expected that, because recently when the Prime Minister was asked about his view on the fact that people were sleeping in cars, what was his response? Those people should go to work and income. Any Prime Minister or any MP who has done constituency work knows what a ridiculous statement that was. We all have people coming through our office doors day in, day out who have been to work and income, and they've been turned away because they either didn't fill in a form properly, or there was a bit of information missing, or there was some little part of an obligation that they weren't quite aware of. There have been, according to work and income workers that I've spoken to, more changes to the welfare system in the past year and a half by policy direction than there was in the welfare reforms a year ago, and all of them are discretionary little blockages to stop people getting the help they need. Now, any Prime Minister who was talking to his own electorate office staff or to people would know that. And I feel the same way about the housing issue that we are facing now. Any Prime Minister worth his salt would know that the 3,000 state houses that this government has sold is coming back tenfold now that we have this housing crisis. And I challenge Nick Smith, I challenge the Prime Minister, I challenge any national member to go and visit Te Puia Marae, where they have done what needed to be done for their community. They opened their doors and they gave people who were desperate a bed. Now, for the minister to stand up in the House today and to say that one of the families that's being referenced to has a brand new baby, To say that they were denied housing because they didn't fill in their forms properly and tell Housing New Zealand they had a baby on the way, well, that just speaks to the problem. They were homeless. They needed a place to live. And naturally, they were scared that if they talked about having a baby on the way, that someone might take their child away from them because they couldn't find a roof. Now, that is a reason why we should be absolutely making sure nothing stands in the way of having a couple like that, let alone a couple with a child housed, but to instead explain it away as a rational reason why they now find themselves at the mercy of being housed by social agencies and not social agencies. A marae who simply is responding to need. I is simply not good enough. I met that little baby, and I would challenge the minister to tell me that simply the incorrect filling of a form is a good reason why that family isn't housed. He needs to visit them. Mr. Speaker, I would challenge all of those members to do the same with education. Go and talk to a principal and ask them if the targeting of 150,000 students leaving behind more than 600,000 is adequate. They have frozen the education budget. Health, pretty much the same. They needed $600 million just to tread water. And anyone who's had a family member show up to hospital recently would have seen how under pressure our health services are. And one shining light, and I will acknowledge this one shining light, particularly while Anne Tolley is in the House, the $36 million that in the next year will go into SIFs to ease the pressure on their frontline services is welcomed. The expert advisory committee who wrote about SIF's modernisation and reform acknowledged they were facing a deficit that could have been as big as $38 million. They needed that cash injection. But we also, Mr. Speaker, need decent investment in early intervention if we're going to improve the outcome for kids. Now, those are the big ones. But perhaps what also deserves some headlines is what's happening in some of the portfolios where the government's hoping that people won't be noticing. Conservation, the cuts that they're experiencing there, water quality. They'll see a reduction of about $10 million per year going into water quality. But then again, if your aim is only to make your rivers wadable instead of swimmable, perhaps you don't need to spend as much money on water quality. Perhaps that's how you make your savings. And for the arts community, I have to respond to that as the portfolio holder. On budget night, we had Minister Barry crowing about the investment into the arts. It equates to about $2 million per annum. What have I ever done? Well, surprisingly, I'm not on the Treasury benches, Maggie Barry. If I was, I would have done a damn sight more than that minister did. $11 million coming out of Creative New Zealand. $11 million being cut from Creative New Zealand, and the minister's response was to find a small amount of money for 3 organisations who were all going backwards. They were stopping touring and were about to cut performers because of the state they were in, and the minister was having celebratory selfies when other arts organisations are going to face cuts of 10%. And she crows that she's done more than me. Give me 1 week in your portfolio, Minister Barry, and I'll show you what you should do with an arts portfolio. Overall, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, this budget could have done so much more. It should have presented a plan on housing. It should have presented a plan on poverty. It should have invested in education. Ultimately, this budget needed to be about people, and it wasn't.
Good speech.